Hi, my name's Phil and I like talking about politics, and sorry for going back to sort of the old setup, but it's all kicked off, hasn't it? Boris Johnson has today requested the prorogation of Parliament, shutting it down for 5 whole weeks, and the Queen has agreed to do this. Now, this is quite remarkable. Before I go through all the details, if you find yourself enjoying the video, then please don't forget to click the like button and subscribe to the channel. So, where to start with this? What has happened is there was always this threat that Boris Johnson was going to prorogue Parliament. There was an argument that it was made illegal. In fact, just to make sure that it was illegal, Dominic Grieve, the former Attorney General, got legislation through Parliament before the summer recess to effectively make it impossible to shut down Parliament, because ministers have to give updates during various times, which means Parliament, even if it's technically suspended, will have certain days where it's sitting again, and then it can take over the business and deal with Brexit. However, it needs to be tested in court, and a case was brought in the Court of Session, which is the Scottish equivalent of the High Court. It was brought in that court simply because it was sitting over summer, and there's going to be a hearing next Thursday. In other words, there's going to be a verdict as to whether this is illegal or not. Now, of course, that would never be the end of it. There'd be appeals, and ultimately the final say on a matter such as this in this country comes from the Supreme Court. However, I was saying as early as this morning, in fact, on my last video, the one that technically I did last night, but I put out today because now I'm back at work, that's how it has to be done. And I was talking about what Parliament's going to do next week, and people said, oh, well, that went out of date really quickly. It's not out of date. Parliament is still sitting next week, and they can still stop this process. They have the power to do that. It's just now made much messier. I expected Boris Johnson to do something like this, but not this soon. It's like giving us lots of notice of it. He could easily have done this at the last minute, which I'll come on to a little bit later. So the reason why I thought this isn't going to be an issue is because I thought the Queen can't possibly agree. Remember, the Prime Minister has no authority to suspend Parliament. This is the Queen. Now, normally prorogation happens at the end of a session to start a new session. And the reason for that, the reason Boris Johnson is giving for all this is saying, oh, well, this session's been going on for a very long time, which it has. It usually lasts about a year. This has been going on for over 2 years. It has been going on for a long time. But Parliament doesn't suspend itself because it thinks, have we been going on for a while? Yeah, we have. We should prorogue. Government has business. Once that business is concluded, then it suspends for a week or two and then begins a new session so it can lay out its next legislative aims. And the aim for this session was to deliver Brexit. So unless Boris Johnson's saying that he wants a new session of Parliament to cancel Brexit, which I strongly suspect he doesn't, then there is no justification for this. And there's certainly no justification for the 5 weeks. We know why this is. It's to put the kibosh on Parliament from debating Brexit. The Speaker of the House, John Bercow, has said that himself. And he's someone who wouldn't normally talk about political events because he's supposed to be apolitical. But of course, this is parliamentary procedure we're talking about. And of course, it is his job to discuss that. But the situation is there's 2 reasons why I didn't think the Queen would agree to it, even if she didn't say no out of hand, that she'd at least wait. First of all, she's been dragged into politics now. She's made a political decision, albeit, I'm sure, based on constitutional advice. She knows that the Prime Minister wants to suspend Parliament. She knows that Parliament does not want to be suspended. She has had to take sides. She has now defied the will of Parliament. Now, no one's blaming her at all, and no one will. But that's effectively what she's done. And as people keep pointing out, the last monarch to do that lost their head. Well, it actually wasn't really true because Charles II also defied Parliament a bit. But since we've had a constitutional monarchy, there's never been a situation where the monarch has defied the will of Parliament. Of course, this is a weird situation because she was forced to either defy the will of the Prime Minister or of Parliament. And neither of those has happened either. But you would think easier for the Prime Minister. But the second reason is this. This court case is next week. That's before prorogation. Remember, this prorogation is not for next week. It's for the week after. It's to take place on the 10th. The actual issue, the order, says that it will happen no earlier than the 9th of September, which is a week next Monday, and no later than the 14th. That's the Friday of that week. But I think the plan is for the 10th, which is the first full day that Parliament would be sitting in that second week. And before that happens, a British court may well have ruled the move illegal. Now, the Queen can't be prosecuted. The Queen will not have committed an illegal act because she can't. the only issue will be, has Boris Johnson committed an illegal act by providing unlawful advice to the Queen? That's very messy. But the fact of the matter is that the act may have been deemed unlawful. And although the Queen is, from that point of view, above the law, she's not in the habit of breaking the law and just going like that because she can get away with it. So that's why it's surprising for me. But it has happened. So now we need to think what can happen and why has Boris Johnson done this? Because the easy answer is to say, well, he's done it so that Parliament's not sitting at a time when they could legislate to force him to go and seek an extension. But in actual fact, first of all, he intends to recall Parliament on the 14th of October, which I'm pretty sure is before the EU summit. And that's when, so Parliament could still potentially act there. And Parliament has a week. Next week, it can do something. It can do something. Whatever it is, I don't know. I know what it can do. And this is what I've been saying for the longest time. What they can definitely do is issue a vote of no confidence on the Tuesday, vote on it and kick Johnson out of government on the Wednesday, and get behind another Prime Minister on the Thursday, and all this goes away. All of it. The reason why that's not been done is because Jeremy Corbyn is insisting that he should be the Prime Minister, but he doesn't have support in other parties. I mean, the SNP are not opposed to him and the Green Party are not opposed as long as he agrees to a public vote before before a general election. But he's not agreeing to that. So I suppose from that point of view, they're not in favour of him unless he changes that stance. But the Liberal Democrats are not at all in favour of Jeremy Corbyn. They won't support him, and the Conservative rebels won't support him either. And Jeremy Corbyn won't support someone who has cross-party appeal. So that plan doesn't look like it would work. So is Boris Johnson, when I say Boris Johnson do this, because technically he's doing it, but ultimately this is Dominic Cummings behind this. The Chaos Meister himself is the one behind this plan. But Boris Johnson the one who's done it. So is his thinking to bounce Parliament into doing something rash? Because yesterday, today the video went out, but yesterday, Jeremy Corbyn promised not to issue a vote of no confidence. Because the reason being, if he does that and Johnson is defeated, let's say, but then Jeremy Corbyn refuses to back another Prime Minister and no one else will back him, then we end up with a general election. Parliament still ends up being suspended in the run-up to that deadline. Johnson wins. So they needed him not to do that unless they've agreed a way forward. But what they also agreed was to follow legislative means. But then Jeremy Corbyn went straight on a news interview that day and said that he is going to issue a vote of no confidence. He didn't say he'd be doing it straight away, by the way, so it's not necessarily completely inconsistent with what he promised. But he did say that he would be doing it and that he'd put himself forward as Prime Minister. So this idea of him saying nothing's off the table, it's not technically completely at odds with that, but it's not given anyone much confidence. Is Boris Johnson doing this to bounce Parliament into doing something rash? Parliament wants to pursue legislative ways of blocking no deal. If they only have a week, that's tricky. You can get legislation through in that time, but it's tricky. And obviously, Brexit supporters in the Lords will try and delay it as much as possible. They'll filibuster. It's very dodgy. It was always the situation that legislative means were unlikely to work anyway. But now you've got a situation where you've only got a week to do it. And although Parliament will be back before the Brexit deadline, if they're not able to legislate to force Boris Johnson to seek a deadline extension, then there'll be no compulsion for him to do so. And then what? Okay, technically, Parliament is still sitting in the couple of weeks, 2 full weeks before the Article 50 deadline. All they could actually do is to revoke Article 50. Now, maybe they would. If Parliament is suspended, doesn't mean to say we're definitely knackered. The other thing to bear in mind is one of the solicitors, a QC, so sort of knows what he's talking about, who is bringing the case against this prorogation that won't be heard until next Thursday. He says he believes that Parliament could be unsuspended. So even if it's suspended, and remember, Parliament would be going into a small recess again anyway. I know it's had summer off and it shouldn't have done, and it's coming back, but it's going straight off again. But I said this months ago when we had the new extension deadline. I said if Parliament doesn't do something before summer, they're really up against it, because September is party conference time. Parliament goes off for a jolly then as well, and it all gets very tribal and messy. And so they're only going to be left with October. And this was before Boris Johnson homed into view and before the idea of prorogation was seriously considered. So, yeah, I mean, Parliament was never going to be that active in September anyway. They're going to have to be... They're having meetings at the moment, the people who are opposed to this no-deal Brexit. And they're going to have those meetings and now decide what to do. The only way they can definitely stop this, the only way... Well, there's two ways. They could just revoke Article 50. They could do that. Or they can depose Boris Johnson. But that means they all have to agree to get behind. They need about 321, 22 MPs, something like that, to get behind a candidate for Prime Minister. And we know that there is no consensus for that at the moment. Whether this urgency will breed that consensus remains to be seen. But, you know, that's the situation as we have it now. It has kicked off, hasn't it? And it's kicked. But the fact that Boris Johnson has done this before he had to, because look at it, Boris Johnson requested that Parliament be prorogued today. The Queen has agreed today. He didn't have to do it this far in advance. It's a shot across the bows, isn't this? It's a warning shot. And it just seems to me it's intended to get a reaction. From Boris Johnson's point of view, it allows him to show that he's tough and he means business and he will be going for a no deal. That's fine. I've heard the opinion expressed. Is he doing it to show the EU is serious so that they agree to his deal? No, because I believe that he understands that what he's asking for of the EU is politically and legally impossible. So he knows that, you know, he might be convincing some of his supporters that his deal sounds reasonable and the EU will agree to it. They can't. It's not physically possible for them to do that. It's not legally possible. So, you know, this is where we are. I'm sure this will be fast moving because there will be announcements, not even when Parliament sits next week, over the next couple of days when, obviously, at the moment, people are just expressing outrage. The Queen has been dragged into politics. Outrageous. It's a constitutional mess. Democracy itself, Boris Johnson is actually suspending democracy. You know, Parliament is our democracy in this country. We have various bodies, but Parliament is the sovereign power in this country. You know, but they're going to have to do more than express outrage. They're going to have to come up with a plan. Whether they announce it or whether they just go ahead with it next week, we will see. But yeah, all kicked off. All kicked off. We'll keep an eye on it anyway. Hope you found the video interesting. If you'd like to support the channel further, then please click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.